The 1246th day of the war, the American army is learning to throw grenades from drones. Learning of such new technologies looks extremely pleasant, but the Z-men recall how Russia demonstrated exactly the same lagging behind the drones at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. In the USA, it seems intended to make a serious fish in the field of cheap UAVs, and the help of Ukraine can be invaluable here. The alarmist estimates of NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte about the total superiority of the Russian military industry over NATO were not confirmed. Analysts have found that, although Russia produces significantly but not many times more ammunition, tank missiles than NATO, it seriously lags behind the artillery system and aviation, which is the dominant superiority of Russia only in long-range drones. Therefore, it is so important that the Ukrainian army and military industry are led by the NATO structure to level the Russian advantage. The order of the Russian Major General to knock down an Azerbaijan plane over Grozny was increased in position before the commanding army of the VVS and the PVO, when it repeats its feat and again orders to kill innocent passengers, the question of time. The VSO was hit by an evacuated former NPP, but it lit up after the attack of the PPO in the Samara region. Ukraine continues to attack Russian rear objects, which is a very effective tactic, a counteraction that Russia has not yet been able to come up with. On the front, the Russians continue to retreat to Sumchina, taking the wounded in the Donetsk region, and Russian armed forces continue to move forward at the cost of suicide sowing through the front line, turning it into a layer pie, where it is difficult to understand even the most experienced ascenders. Russian losses remain huge due to constant false reports and ignoring the foundations of the military case, which were laid back in the last century. Russian informants try to drive all the truths and untruths into a contract, threatening to be sent to the Kursk region and promising to be fired in a year. Of course, this is not true. There is no return route from the contract until the end of the so-called SVO, but informants learn about this when it is too late. About this and much more in today's SVG, which you can support with your likes, comments, and subscription to the channel. All these actions help promote the video, especially your subscription. They are important for YouTube algorithms, so do not forget to click on the subscribe button. It will seriously help promote the video. Well, you can also support the channel on Patreon. The link to it will be in the description. Choose the level of support and receive the corresponding bonuses. Also, you can support the channel by buying NVPN, which allows you to watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, Instagram, go to blocked media. In general, it is not the state that decides what to watch, listen, and read. Everyone has a VPN now, and this is necessary, but if you want not just to buy a high-quality product, but to support, for example, this channel, then NVPN is your choice. The link to it is in the description. In Russia, the use and purchase of VPN is legal, and even new amendments to the bill do not change this at all. VPN is still not prohibited. They can still and need to use it. Well, we are moving on to what happened in the past day. The Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine in the shortest possible time has adopted, and Zelensky signed, the bill limiting the independence of Ukrainian anti-corruption authorities, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and special anti-corruption prosecutors. In the Ukrainian society, including among activists and military who I read, there was a storm of discontent, and in Kiev and a number of other cities of Ukraine, there were protests that may continue today. I'm not ready to give my assessment of what happened, and not only because I'm as far away from Ukrainian politics as possible. I read different opinions. Someone says that the actual elimination of the independence of anti-corruption structures is a big step back. In fact, as I understand it, this is what European partners of Kiev think. Others write that NABU was inefficient and completely closed, which is doubtful, especially in the conditions of war. I don't know who is right, and I have no time and opportunity to figure it out since my focus is on war. I'm not Ukrainian, and I have no deep understanding of Ukrainian politics and the processes taking place there in society. For me, it is only important that Russian drones and rockets do not fly over the cities of the country, and the fascist occupants did not destroy the citizens of Ukraine. The only thing I can say is that how these corrections were carried out does not say that it was an honest, open, competitive procedure, regardless of the attitude to the NABU. In fact, all this was done in a special operation mode. Well, and what else can I say again, based on my framework, which includes everything related to the war, directly and indirectly? If the new law closes the case of slavery on fortifications or on the purchase of weapons, then you will definitely hear about it from me. In the meantime, let's continue the conversation about Russian aggression, which, in my opinion, remains the main problem of Ukraine. And if you still want to understand what is happening in Ukrainian politics, then I can only recommend reading independent publications such as, for example, Ukrainian Truth and Envy. They are fairly free in their judgments and are not afraid to speak against certain actions of the authorities when they see a reason for this. And in general, I have repeated many times that even now, in the conditions of war in Ukraine, the freedom of speech is much, much higher than even the Russian one. There is still a risk of peaceful times, even before the full-scale invasion. Therefore, there is a very different range of opinions, both among the military and among activists, among the publications of various independent authorities in Kiev. Therefore, there is a large space for civil society. You probably all remember the statement of NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte about the multiple superiority of Russia in military production over all NATO countries together. In particular, he stated that Russia produces has more ammunition in 3 months, and all NATO countries in a year. It is clear that Rutte said this in order to tighten the development of the defense industry, including in a year, but any person must first of all speak the truth. Therefore, Conflict Intelligence Team and Radio Liberty decided to check Rutte's statements, and it turned out that Russia really surpasses NATO's military production by some indicators, but not so catastrophically, and by others it lags behind. With full text of the research, you can get acquainted on the Radio Liberty website or on the Telegram channel Conflict Intelligence Team, but in general, the conclusions were as follows. According to the most conservative estimates, in 2025, Europe and the United States will make a total of 1,700,000 artillery shots of a caliber of 155, and these opportunities will continue to expand. Russia plans to manufacture up to 3 million shells of a caliber of 152 and 122 in 2025, and it seems to be at the limit of its own capabilities without a complete transfer of the economy to military rails. That is, there's superiority, but not 12 times, as Rutte said, and this superiority will be reduced. Speaking of what to shoot with these ammunition, Russia produces no more than 100 new artillery guns a year. NATO countries 362 and NATO artillery, according to many indicators, surpasses Russian, although Russia still has thousands of old guns, which NATO simply does not have. As for tanks, according to the previous study by CIT, Russia produces about 280 new tanks a year. The United States and Germany together, 159. At the same time, again, Germany plans to expand production, and the American production capacity of tanks is barely a quarter. Let me remind you, Russia's stock is getting worse. Tanks that are being restored and modernized are running out, and the next months are running out. In aviation, NATO keeps its historical superiority. Every year, it produces from 227 to 320 fighters against 4755 Russian ones. In the country of NATO, even without the United States, Russia is twice as good as the fighters of the 5th generation, 5 times. And the gap will increase as the American F-35s are delivered. At the same time, Russia has an overwhelming superiority over long-range drones. There are no analogs of shacks in mass production in NATO countries, and the double superiority over the production of long-range missiles is also due to Russia. Due to this, the current problems for both sides of the potential conflict are the PVOs, and here, researchers have found it difficult to calculate the total production. But they stated that both in NATO and in Russia, provided with PVOs is clearly not enough. In NATO, they do not know how to defend themselves from Russian shacks. In Russia, even by pulling almost all PVOs to the Ukrainian front, they constantly miss noticeable strikes from the enemy with far from the strongest air component. It can be imagined that there will be a case of confrontation with many times stronger NATO aviation. In general, in Europe and the USA, it is impossible to stop at what is reached. It is worth reducing the gap with Russia, especially since, according to such important indicators as, for example, artillery, ammunition, and tanks, there are all possibilities for this. I will add that the situation with drones can change as the production of BPA for Ukraine by Ukrainian technologies develops in NATO countries. And in general, the inclusion of Ukraine as an alliance can significantly change the production balance in favor of NATO, especially with drones, where only Ukraine has at least a parity with Russia in artillery ammunition. More details on why the Ukrainian-Russian defense is so effective in some nomenclatures, in comparison with the European one, can be found in my video on this topic. Russia continues to develop a drone industry, in which it still has an indisputable superiority over NATO, in many respects due to the weakness of the sanctions. In the video, we talked about the new Russian PPL, which looks like a small copy of the Shad and is used as a scout and a false target, and can also carry a combat part with a weight of up to 15 kg. All components of this drone have Chinese origin. More than half of them are produced by the company Suroman for technology. Although in October 2022, this enterprise announced the end of the supply of products to the Russian and Ukrainian markets in order to prevent its use for military purposes. Ukrainian drone specialist Sergei Flash Bezkrasnov adds that this drone is equipped with a powerful radio modem, which allows radio control to be carried out by one or several drones at once. He suggests that in the future it is planned to equip such systems with parts of Shads and thus make them a signal retranslator for each other in order to track the work of the PVO in real time, to conduct reconnaissance, to attack. Moving targets and objects in the area of Ukrainian means of fire. In Ukraine, of course, sooner or later they will come up with a means of counteraction with this Russian innovation. For example, Ukraine and Denmark are together developing a drone interceptor with artificial intelligence, says Defense Express. It is reported that the Ukrainian company Odd Systems has joined the Danish defense concern Therma Group to create a high-tech complex that can automatically detect, track, and destroy different types of enemy BPLs. From commercial Mavics to reconnaissance and strike shots, the beginning is commendable, but again, the problem of Russian strike drones, which these drones must solve, would not be so sharp if the sanctions were constantly expanding, and most importantly, they were observed. That is, there would be strict control over them because Russia itself, of its own components, nothing, I repeat, nothing except for booze can produce. Well, we, looking at Western production, technology, and arms race, should not forget that the main thing that is now for the protection of Ukraine is the Ukrainian army, which we can help here and now, and we have been doing this for quite a long time. But the war has not ended and the need for help is still there. Therefore, we continue to gather at the Mavic for SBPAK 33 OSHP. Here is their address, I remind you of it. We wish you good health to the members of the Streltsy Battalion of the 33rd Separate Assault Regiment. We express our gratitude to Michael Nacke for his work on the information front. We also turn to Michael and his supporters, asking them to support the collection of Maverick 3T, Maverick Enterprise, and their complete antenna. For our collection in the airspace, you can support the collection with the help of monobanks. The QR code is here on the screen. The link to Monobank, Private, PayPal, and USDT TRC20 is in the description. Unfortunately, Monobanks has this feature. It is very difficult to get them to accept payments from abroad for new users. Therefore, there are alternatives in the form of PayPal, in the form of cryptocurrency. In general, we collected almost half of it yesterday. Let's not stop. Let's help the Ukrainian military to contain Russian aggression, destroy the occupants, protect their fellow citizens and their country. All the links are in the description. Of course, I have already participated in the collection and I think I will participate again. And thank you to everyone who participates. It helps to preserve the lives of Ukrainian defenders and Ukraine as a whole. Well, we're moving on. Have you ever seen a drone throwing a grenade? A stupid question for those who have been watching the Russian-Ukrainian war for a long time. But it was asked in the official account of the US Army in the now remote tweet, where they showed the first execution of such a drop-off in the American land forces. The US has discovered unknown technologies straight from 2022, is ironic about this C-channel. You will listen to the 173rd Air Descent Brigade of the 7th Army Training Command of the US Air Force. For the first time in the history of the US Army, there was a drop-off of a hand grenade from a Skydio X-10D quadcopter at the Grafenweiher, Germany training ground. On the other hand, we have no idea, the informant adds right away, about what undeniable advantages small drones give on the battlefield. We could observe from the experience of the Syrian campaign in 2017, when various terrorist groups inflicted significant damage to the forces supporting Assad, due to the use of the aforementioned drones. However, from our side, analysis and conclusions to the beginning of the war were not made, writes Sekkanal. And I, on the other hand, will add that terrorist organizations supporting Assad and, for example, Hezbollah, and even though the Russian battle forces were still firing at the terrorists, they still did not adopt the tactics of using drones. Moreover, continues the informant, in response to an attempt to convey such important information in the style of Englishmen don't clean their weapons with bricks, all this was called nothing more than child's play. This, of course, does not cancel the fact that the United States is extremely behind Ukraine and Russia in the field of small drones and the fight against them, which is why the recently diffused manual on tank tactics on social networks, where drone FPVs were offered to knock down with card shells from Abrupt's cannons. Nevertheless, the United States is now trying to catch up and overtake its potential opponents in the drone sphere, and here the invaluable help of Ukraine can be found. We are waiting for the details of the mega debate on drones announced by Zelensky. Well, in principle, it is not scary to make mistakes, it is not scary to be funny, it is scary not to develop. As you remember, just a year ago, I think, maybe a little less, some commander of the American crew said on a video on Twitter that I'm not scared of drones, I'm in a tank, and then, of course, it caused a stormy reaction. But the fact that the United States understands, at least partially, its lag and wants to compensate for it is great. The fact that they are trying and learning to make drops from drones is great, and that they do it before they started a fight with someone. Therefore, no, this is not the wrong way. Yes, it looks funny, especially for those who watch the war closely. But again, the first steps are needed in order to do further. And we wish the Americans good luck in this, and Ukraine can give them a lot in this sense. Therefore, America can get for its investment not only, in fact, holding such a reputable charm that the American force is still projected in the world, but also specific effective technologies and tactics of use, which Ukraine can convey to the United States. Azerbaijani newspaper Minvalpolitika published the alleged data of the commanders who gave the order to open fire on a civilian plane, Azalimbrar 190, from the battle on December 25, 1924, over Grozny. According to them, he is the commander of the 51st Division of the PVO of the 4th Guard Army of the VVS and the PVO of the Southern Military District General Major Alexander Vasilyevich Talpilo. It is stated that during a preliminary internal investigation, Colonel Nikolai Nikolaevich Orlyansky, who received the order of Talapilo and had already commanded the captain, to shoot at the enemy at unidentified air targets in the town of Politchuk. The Ministry of Defense writes that the information about this news came from the Politchuk report. In the letter, it is said that after the incident, despite the direct involvement of General Major Talapilo, criminal responsibility was avoided. He blamed the staff of the Rostov Center, the United Organization of the Air Movement of the Russian Federation, for evidently false evidence, claiming that the missiles launched from the RPK, the anti-missile launch complex Panzer S of the 274 combat vehicle, were self-liquidated and could not damage the plane. The statements were verified by an internal investigation carried out by the 505th Military Investigation Department of the SKRF, the building claims. It is stated that the calculation of the RPK was in an inappropriate technical and organizational state, which did not allow the civilian plane to be identified in time. Despite this, General Talapilo was promoted to his post. Currently, he is appointed Deputy Commander of the 11th Guard Army of the Air Force of the Eastern Military District, and was awarded according to Putin's decree. At the moment, Astro failed to reach out to Politchuk, as well as to the regular Ramadov, who is indicated in the text of the letter as one of the military personnel of the PVO. Earlier, Politchuk, in a conversation with Astro, confirmed that he is a military personnel but refused to comment as he is far from politics. This is how the Russian system of collective irresponsibility works. The plane is knocked down and there are no culprits involved. The culprits are fired up, no measures are taken, and everything is ready for the next incident. In a good way, the conclusions should have been made even after the fall of the Russian Buk of the Malaysian Boeing in 2014, not even because of the special desire to protect civilians in the combat zone, but because of the huge reparation losses caused by Russia and the Kremlin regime. But as the tragedy with the Azerbaijan liner showed, no conclusions were made, and now they will not be. Yesterday, the Ukrainian Western production plane crashed, this time the French Mirage 2000, and so it was reported in the Air Force of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In the evening of July 22, 1925, during the flight mission on the Mirage 2000 fighter, there was a failure of aviation equipment, which the pilot reported to the flight manager. He acted competently, as it should be in critical situations, and successfully catapulted. Search and rescue team found the pilot. His condition was stable on the ground. There were no injured. A special commission was appointed to establish the causes of the aviation accident. Ukraine, in a short period of time, has mastered the use and service of Western fighters F-16 and Mirage 2000. In combination with the high intensity of their use, including for the reflection of air raids, this leads to a certain inevitable cost. In addition to Mirage, in a similar way, 4 F-16 have already been lost. This, of course, does not mean that you cannot worry about doing the duty phrase like at war everything happens. Western partners of Ukraine must invest funds in the service of Ukrainian aviation, training of new pilots and ground personnel, as well as sending new ships, so that the existing fleet does not have to drive to the limits of its capabilities. This is also in the interests of NATO countries, because they receive invaluable lessons in the application of Western aircraft in the conditions of conflict with Russia and wider, in the conditions of high-intensity conflict with an equal and even superior opponent. They have never had any experience. Ukraine continues to strike deep into Russia. Novokhybersk NPP caught fire after a BPL attack in the Samara region. On the morning of July 22, local residents reported about the attack on Novokhybersk in the Samara region. The governor also commented on the situation. This morning on the territory of our region, when trying to attack one of the industrial enterprises, several enemy unmanned aerial vehicles were destroyed. There are no victims of destruction. For safety reasons, temporary restrictions on mobile internet were introduced on the territory of the region. This necessary measure helps our military to suppress the enemy. However, as Astra found out, at least 2 UAVs were hit on the territory of the Novokhybersk NPP, as a result of which a fire occurred at the enterprise. The fire was already extinguished. On the Rosneft website, it is reported that it was at this plant that the production of many types of products, such as fuel for jet engines, oil for light cars, and others, was first developed. The project power of NKNPZ processing is more than 8.8 million tons of oil per year. The plant is processing processing Allenberg Western Siberian oil, as well as oil produced by companies in the Samara region. And it, evacuating from NKNPZ, produces more than 20 types of commodity, including motor fuel of the highest environmental standards for all types of transport, such as transport of car, aviation, railway, river, and sea vessels. NKNPZ is one of the main manufacturers and suppliers of bitumen products and fuel for the high-class jet engines, the most in demand in Russia, they say. As we can see, NKNPZ has not only economic value. Fuel for jet engines is necessary for planes and rockets, which are hit by Ukrainian civilian and military objects every day. The scale of damage is not known yet, but if it seems insufficient, then I hope in the near future we should expect a repeat visit of Ukrainian drones. As for the new tactics of Ukrainian strikes in general, the founder of the ASIM project, Cyberborjno Vanglashko, published an extremely interesting material about the evolution of the goals and tactics of Ukrainian strikes in the depths of the territory of Russia of the so-called deep strikes, as well as methods of protection against them. First, he believed that if you consider just by the number of hits, then the result of the Ukrainian strikes has decreased, but not significantly. Conditionally, in the first quarter of this year, mostly by the NPP and all bases, providing about 2.9 successful hits per week. Then in the future, after the transition to strikes on the VPC objects and military infrastructure, it began to be fixed by 2.33 successful strikes per week. At the same time, military plants represent much more complex objects than the NPP. The latter represent a single system operating in harsh conditions of high temperatures and pressure, where the defeat of one node leads to a critical breakdown of the entire system. At the same time, military plants, first of all, are historically located in the depths of the Russian territory, and secondly, they are a set of isolated nodes from each other, where hitting one does not affect the others. In addition, the Russians have recently taken serious measures to protect the plants. They install a PVO system next to them, primarily for RPK Panzer, which is well recommended against drones and also slowly unfolds mobile fire groups, equipment of drone interceptors, often collected from factory employees. They also begin to install nets above the workshops, but they are no different from the effectiveness of the evolution of military units of Ukrainian drones, which demask the important elements of production. Where there's a net, there it is necessary to hit. Ukraine, in turn, expands the equipment of the used BPA, uses models with an enhanced combat part and jet drones, which are not only difficult to knock down, but also distract the attention of the PVO as the priority targets. Also used are bait drones and tactics of frontal attacks, when one group of drones overloads the enemy PVO, and the other at this time enters the target from the flanks and rear. Although it is more difficult to hit the military plants than the NPP and all bases, Ukraine adapts to new challenges and painfully hits the Russian VPK, also stretches the Russian VPK, which creates opportunities for new blows, makes a conclusion of Glushko. His full material can be read on the site Media Media in Ukrainian or English. And I think that we will soon try to make this material in the form of a video, because this is an insanely interesting analyst. Russia continues the tactic of terror to destroy the cities of Donbass, which are under the control of Ukraine. In Kramatorsk and Slaviansk, 12 wounded as a result of airstrikes, Ukrainian journalist Andrei Soplienko said. In Kramatorsk, as a result of airstrikes, a child was killed in 2015. The number of victims increased to 8 people. The head of the Kramatorsk City Military Administration, Alexander Gontrenko, wrote that 3 multi-story houses and a kindergarten were damaged. In Slaviansk, 4 were injured, 2 men, 2 women, from 39 to 63 years old, writes Soplienko. All of them have been diagnosed with mine explosion injuries, fractures, cut wounds. Mayor of Slaviansk Vadim Layak reported that private houses and buildings of Donbass State Pedagogical University have been destroyed. This is a familiar Russian tactic since the times of Grozny, Aleppo, and Debaltsevo. Russian artillery and aviation do not make a difference between civilian and military objects, destroying everything on the path of the Russian army. Drones have recently been added to it, and now Russian pilots are already intentionally striking civilian objects, cars, and even people if they do not meet the military goal, and often immediately send the BPA to civilians, as it happens in Kherson and far from there. The Russian army destroys civilians on the front line not only with the help of artillery, aviation, and drones. Russian soldiers periodically arrange local bushes in the settlements they enter. The Project Borakiv describes one of these episodes on the video, Ukrainian 63rd MBR from Torsk-Kanalmanskoye direction, where recently penetrated Russian military. A group of 3 Russian scoundrels who entered the settlement shot a civilian who was riding a bicycle. Subsequently, the military criminals were tracked and destroyed in a PV drone artillery in the Soviet Union. I would like the same instant karma to reach any Russian military criminal, but some, unfortunately, will still have to wait for their scooter. Ideally, this karma should reach them before they commit another military crime and kill a civilian. The stop of the Russian army, the occupation army, is not a question of territory. It is not a question of flags that are being developed over certain settlements. It is a question of murders. Russia kills citizens of Ukraine. And it did this in Bucha, in the city of Irpin, and in many other settlements, including Mariupol, the scale of the horrors in which we still do not even quite imagine. Because it is still in occupation, Therefore, yes, the Russian army kills people first of all and captures territories in the second. Therefore, those who tell you that it does not matter under what flag and all that, these are just people who justify the actions of the Russian army, trying to substitute the concept. Russia destroys Ukraine, does not capture, destroys. Including those cities that are called the Russian world and which allegedly came to defend, kill people, on a bicycle, without a bike, with shots, shelling, rockets, bombs. Russia kills people in the neighboring country every day. This must be understood in order to understand what kind of war it is and why there is no other morally justified position except for the support of the victims of aggression, except for the support of Ukraine in this war against Russia, which Russia started, which Russia continues, which is aggressive, invading, and fascist occupation, because Russia destroys civilians, including the citizens of Ukraine, and does it consciously. Anatoly Radov, a pro-Russian war blogger, continues to pass unhappy news for the Russian army from the Sumy direction. Here's what he writes about the situation in Kondrativka, where the Ukrainian counterattack continues. The Sumy region of Kondrativka was hit by a little dust yesterday. From the west side, they stopped at Prudov, but nevertheless, ours are gradually retreating from the village. Next, they will probably work again with FABs. On the positions of the enemy inside the settlement, the north tried to enter our reinforcements, but also retreated. At the moment, it is not the best idea to go there in small groups. The most important question here now is not to hold several houses, but to pull out all 300s. This, of course, does not mean that for Russian armed forces, in fact, everything is bad. Vladimir Gradov writes about the promotion in Yunukovka, which, in principle, is confirmed by deep state data. Ukrainian military officer Stanislav Bunyatov thus characterizes the situation in general. In the Sumy direction, fierce battles continue every day. In some areas, our forces are successful. However, Russian armed forces continue to pull up reserves. The majority of losses from both sides are from the disposal of ammunition and FPV drones, Bunyatov indicates. Analysts of deep state note the progress of the Russians in the Arikov region on the western flank of the Pokrovsky direction. In the direction of Dnepropetrovshchina, as well as in the area of the Mayak and Zadishka on the eastern flank to the north of Myrnohrad, where the VSRF expands the platform for the offensive in the direction of the Pokrovsk-Dobropolye highway. Analyst Tatargami adds the context of yesterday's message about the penetration of Russian DRGs into Pokrovsk. Here's what he writes. The reports of the Ukrainian monitoring project Deep State are accurate. Indeed, a small Russian sabotage group managed to penetrate Pokrovsk a few days ago. At the time of writing the post, on the night of July 21-22, it was confirmed that some groups reached the outskirts of the city itself and continue to be there. Unfortunately, messages about the penetration of Russian sabotage groups into the city were used as part of Russian information operations to spread panic, mainly by increasing the scale of the invasion. In fact, the penetration was carried out by only a few very small groups. The last messages that I received from the city prove that additional Russian forces broke through the triad and are trying to fix themselves on the outskirts. This indicates that the defense remains vulnerable, mainly due to the lack of personnel and problems with coordination between units. Russian sabotage groups penetrated Pokrovsk back in 2024, although without any significant success. Therefore, these incidents should not be treated as evidence of control over the city. But the increase in the number of invasion of the DPRK indicates a more serious problem, the Riga notes. Moreover, this problem is much larger than what was written in detail in the Deep State, but we'll talk about it a little later. In the Donetsk region, according to the Deep State, the Russians finally occupied the Grushevskaya settlement and advanced in the region of Voskresenka, which, despite the fake video with the Logovtik, Russian armed forces have not taken so far. Despite this, the Russian movement in this direction continues, albeit not at the same pace as 2 weeks ago, and there are no prerequisites for its installation yet, unfortunately. However, I would like to note that the Russians have not yet succeeded in making a serious breakthrough over Dnipropetrovsk region in this area. State has published a long-promised and extremely interesting post about how Russian tactics have changed, why Russian armed forces still manage to move forward due to huge losses, and why the video with the flags of the ticks has ceased to adequately reflect the situation on the front. This is what the analyst wrote, the secret pressure of Russian armed forces and changes in the nature of the battle. On the image, you can see the marks of the Russian military fixations in different points, which are already in the rear of the line of contact. It would seem that it is worth making a corresponding mark, fixing the Russian in any landing or even in the settlement, especially if there are frames of the defeat from the defense force or the enemy hang their next rag. Usually, many channels or projects following the course of combat actions do exactly this. They immediately run to write posts about the promotion and draw their maps. But the reality of combat actions has long been different from what it was before, and the Russians are gradually changing their tactics, and it will simply not be possible to mark by video. We have been insisting on this for a long time. Lately, in different areas of the front, the same situations are happening, as in the image in this post. The enemy not only puts pressure on the position of Ukrainian fighters with small groups, but also leaves the task of penetrating as deep as possible into the rear, hiding and trying to survive, to secure themselves before the arrival of a new group. But in most cases, an infantry or their small group, which manages to break through to the rear, remains there forever. Drone operators or artillery try to eliminate the enemy immediately. Such attempts by Russian armed forces give them an advantage in promotion, as they spread the power and attention directed at the discovery and destruction of these groups. At the same time, Russians are deliberately going to die in such assault actions. The problem is also the catastrophic lack of people in defense, because of which it is not possible to close holes in positions at the right time. It is through them that the Russian military moves to the rear, another reason for applying to the map of wide gray zones, which more and more often appear in updates. Our team constantly finds out whether the Russians were able to secure themselves in the zone of previous fixation, or if they have already been destroyed. We cannot emotionally react to each event because our designation is a huge responsibility to society and the military. But since the Russians have the opportunity to penetrate there, the gray zones, accordingly, increase. They can change color at any moment, most of the time in red. Such war realities where the SRF has a number of advantages in infantry, ready to consciously die in the storm at one end, achieve constant success in promotion. Next to the problem, there is a shortage of people on our side, which creates lies in defense, and lies in reports about the real situation only aggravates the situation and enhances the success of the enemy. An example is the event in Pokrovsk. I mean the penetration of the DRG, which I talked about yesterday and today. Gore showed video applications of ground robotic complexes in the combat zone. Here is a live example of what I talked about in my recent video about the war of the future. Robots will replace people on the battlefield, and this future comes before our eyes. A special interesting moment in the video is indicated by the Project War Archive. The Guru of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine demonstrates the use of ground robotic complexes NRK for logistics, as well as for the destruction of living forces and the shelter of Russian armed forces on various sections of the front. At the 0.058 mark, a ground drone with 2 Bulgarian grenade launchers Bull Spy of the channel KRPG-22 makes a shot at the building with the enemy. The video also shows the entrance of the RK kamikazes to the building on the Russian position. Minute 46, the ambush of the RK, which exploded at the moment when 2 occupants ran past it. Of course, all these actions would be insanely dangerous for a person. In the forces of defense, they try to protect people. Firstly, because it is beneficial to distinguish them from the Russian meat conveyor. Secondly, because Ukraine chronically lacks a personal composition. And thirdly, no matter how cynical this may sound, robots are much cheaper for the state. Recall that the compensation in Ukraine for the death of the fighter is 15 million hryvnias, $360,000 at the current rate. As for Russia and the problems with the lie in its reports, the channel is what leads to the video where the concept of taking the population of the credit points is explained, which is spread all over the Russian army. It is noteworthy here that the readers of the channels will now learn about how Russian armed forces are at war in general topics, which are not directly written about the war. In the reports of the Ministry of Defense, the same village can be liberated several times. This is not a mistake, but a practice that the fighters call take the settlement in credit, the channel authors explain. At first in the reports, they declare successes for reporting in beautiful pictures, and then a real battle begins. The soldiers are attacked to confirm the already voiced liberation of any price. In the zone of a special military operation, there is such a concept from the guys to take the settlement into credit. Did you hear this? Everything is clear. Yes, it was considered that they had already taken it, but in fact, yes, you know, it happens that cities are taken into credit, and then when they took it into credit, it is necessary to pay by credit. And then meat assaults begin, for example, with huge losses, with broken equipment. We do not yet have to talk about demoralization in the SSU. That is, they are very serious. They provide very serious resistance. We have as always, there are certain problems with the technical filling of the units. We feel the lack of FPV drones, connection problems, technical problems, but the biggest problem is the general command of the troops. That is, this is. The general staff, I'm afraid that even if a special military operation is successfully completed, I'm afraid that it will be the first victory. Do you understand? It seems to me that this is why the Russian authorities seek to block the Telegram and limit the search for crummy content. Because the truth about how the military operations are going sounds literally from every corner. And as the Russian army is being replenished, the growth of losses with these practices is being faced by more and more Russian families. This, of course, will not work because, for example, even in Nazi Germany, the population realized that the war was going in a completely different way than the propaganda claims. In particular, because the reality of the funerals from the front, the bomb of allies, and constantly expensive products regularly knocked on their doors. In fact, the presentation of the Germans about the situation tells the anecdote that went on at that time without any telegram. Hitler and Göring are sitting on the Berlin radio tower. What would I do to cheer up the Germans? Asks Hitler. Why don't you jump down, my Führer? Göring suggests. There are also more large-scale reasons why the Russian army is carrying record losses, which I talked about in a recent video. The Ukrainian channel Myrnohrad Sun usually does not write updates on a specific situation on the front line, but sometimes gives extremely interesting generalizations. This time, he touched on the concept of culmination introduced by German and military theorists of the early 19th century by Karl Clausewitz, whose work is still studied in military academies and is based on the military doctrine of Western countries. This is what the author of the channel wrote. The culmination moment in Clausewitz's theory is the moment of war or battle, after which the further offensive loses its meaning, even if it continues successfully, because there are risks of defeats due to exhaustion of strength, loss of pace, or going beyond the limits of the accuracy. At the tactical level, we encounter such a moment, as far as I remember, 3 times. For the first time, this happened in the current Svatovsky direction during the battles for Chervonopovka, an attempt to approach Kremenno, despite the obvious increase in the opportunity of the enemy in defense. The second time, we encountered this during the attempt to surround Bakhmut, when they were entangled in Kleshivka and in Berkovsko Reservoir. Despite the initial tactical success, we were unable to crush the enemy even with the use of reserves. The third time, probably in Krinky. Zaporizhzhia campaign remains behind the scenes, where the direction of the Takmak nuts was pointless from the very beginning, and the direction of the great Novoselskaya Mayorskaya did not reach its culmination point, since it was initially considered as a distracting maneuver. When planning an offensive, it is necessary to indicate the expected culmination point, when the unit will need to pause reinforcements or maneuvers to avoid a fracture. We either did not determine such a point at all, or it was determined wrongly. Due to the incorrect or absent calculation of the ratio of the power and funds, and the ignoring of the NATO system of analysis of various factors affecting the operation, Russian armed forces have reached culmination points on all levels more than once, but despite this, it continued to act, erasing storm groups in order to preserve the overall pace of the offensive. In most cases, the absence of changes on the deep state map does not mean at all the absence of attempts to storm the site. According to the clause, the offensive after reaching the culmination point is not purposeful, because the losses begin to exceed the dividends of this very offensive. Apparently in the Russian army for 200 years, no one dared to read the clause except for early Soviet military theorists executed in the years of Stalin's repressions. Therefore, the Soviet Union is still conducting attacks for the sake of the offensive, even when it is necessary to stop to strengthen, replenish, and prepare for a new operation. And therefore, the Ukrainian counterattacks regularly come to the same gravel in the form of exhaustion. If in Ukraine, the counteroffensive of 2023 and the sit-down in cranes became an object of serious public discussion, then the eternal Russian tactics of senseless rollbacks are only called out to the Z channel, although apparently it has recently become so loud that it was decided to ban it. Because it is known that if you ignore the problem, it may disappear on its own. Russian officials and cops wipe their feet not only about the so-called SVO veterans, but also about the active Russian military. The military service reported that on August 18, 2025, police officers stopped it in Moscow, and when they examined the car, they discovered the RAP Hunter system, since the system was collected by volunteers. There were no accompanying documents with it. For this reason, the military service was detained and all kinds of services were called to the scene. In short, everyone came to my soul. Look how many terrorists they took. The fact came to the point that the staff of the special services intended to take not only equipment for examination, but also the car on which the raw material was transported. They want to take the car for the examination. They want to take the RAP. The police officer noted that he was affected by the way the police officers behaved who stopped him. One of them, after the arrival of the specialists, simply rested in the car. He got into the car and sat there, smiled, enjoyed, watched what was happening. The second police officer tried to explain what and why he was taking to the combat zone. Yesterday, 2 cars were destroyed, 3 soldiers were killed while transporting provisions to the front line, and 200 or 300 cars were destroyed because, unfortunately, they did not have such a good RAP that they needed. In response, a police officer stated that he was not interested in what kind of installation it was and whose life it would save. According to the military officer, such employees of state agencies have no place in the service. The question is, who are we defending there? Or is it time for us to arrange raids in Russia, catch such volunteers? What are they serving for in the infrastructure? I would also add that the incident should be thanked not only for the eternal police self-preservation, but also the Ukrainian special services. After the Peacock operation, which, according to Russian border guards, was hit by drones partially assembled in Russia and under the guise of volunteers, the state security authorities were caught by collective paranoia about the transfer of anything uninstalled and undocumented. And in fact, the hero of the video experienced this paranoia on himself in full. Let's hope it will only increase. Russia is continuing to force all the truth and untruths to sign contracts, which is now especially important against the background of the State Duma's initiative to conduct a year-round strike. We signed a contract from 5/07/2025 under the psychological pressure of the junior Lieutenant Dmitry Dorjiev. Namely, he scared us by saying that if we stay on the deadline, we will be sent to Kursk. If people are sent to Kursk without a deadline, only 70% of them return and 30% die there. Yuri Vitsinets, a soldier of the emergency service, Kiribayev, Deniyar, and Majiv Denis told that almost immediately after the arrival in the city of Kakster in the Republic of Buryatia, the commander of the platoon, the younger Lieutenant Bayer Dishadarjev, began to scare them by sending them to the border zone, telling examples of the mass deaths of conscripts in the Kursk region. At the same time, young people were inspired that if they signed a contract, they would be in the unit and return home in a year. If we sign a contract, we will serve in the unit, and in a year we will be able to leave. After the conscripts signed the contract, they were told that in fact they had to serve until the end of their service. And they asked the junior lieutenant to cancel the report, which they received an answer that all the documents had already been sent to the formalities. However, as it turned out, they were deceived here, since the documents, according to the eyewitnesses, were in Desidarji's office. The papers with the reports are on his table, and he hasn't sent them anywhere. Also, the conscripts were initially refused the opportunity to write refused reports. After the appeal of Yuri's sister, the conscripts were able to write them, but they didn't know if they were sent by appointment or remained on the officer's table. According to the conscripts, they do not have any documents, copies, reports, or contracts with which they could turn to the lawyer for an argumented dispute between the prisoners' contracts and their eviction, and they didn't give us any copies or anything. And here we have, it turns out, another boy signed. Well, there was another one, it turns out, from the first platoon, and they gave him the papers, it turns out, all the copies that he signed. Soldiers of the emergency service and their relatives ask for help in spreading the video to achieve the expulsion of illegal contracts. Here it is necessary to say again, a contract with the Russian army is a ticket to one end. There are no short-term contracts from the autumn of 2022. You will most likely be able to leave the Russian army only with your feet forward, since the fighters do not sign even on the most serious injuries. There were no cases of expulsion of a contract due to pressure or incorrect order. Therefore, the only winning strategy in the game with death from the Russian army, which is the same, is not to play. Do not sign a contract, do not go to the military command, leave the country. If you have such an opportunity, pass this information to your loved ones who are in danger of getting into the army or who are thinking about signing a contract. In the war in Ukraine, the teacher of the Moscow School of Education, Gennady Staranov, died. In 1922, he was recognized as a Teacher of the Year. His death was reported by the General Director of the Presidential Platform of the Russian State of Opportunities, Andriy Batin. Staranov participated in the war in Ukraine from October 22 to January 23. The founder was a member of the mobilized at the training ground in Belarus, Russian Minister of Education Sergei Kravtsov. He came there and gave Staranov the sign of the Ministry of Education of Youth and Professionalism. In May 25, Staranov took part in a meeting of the Observatory Council, It is Russia, the Country of Opportunities, which was held in the Kremlin by Vladimir Putin. Then he suggested to Putin to create a system of pre-competitive training for SVO participants so that after returning they could more easily integrate into state projects. In Donbass, even before the Russian invasion, there was a joke in the region, the city of opportunities. You can leave, for example. Now, respectively, Russia is a country of opportunities. For example, you can die in the capture war, well, or not to participate in this bloody circus and talk about it with your friends and acquaintances. The choice is yours. Well, Michael Nacke was with you, and see you soon. All the best. Bye.